What is happening, my fellow Stephen King fans? James Hancock here, back to review the latest episode of Castle Rock, an episode called The Box. And it feels a little inappropriate to be reviewing this show when it's nice and sunny outside here in New York. However, this show, all the new episodes drop a little after midnight. And while sometimes I'm up late as hell, jacked on caffeine, editing episodes of my podcast Wrong Reel, it's a little tough to dive into a review at that time of night. So here I am, better late than never. But I have to say, in the week since the first 3 episodes posted, I've had an absolute blast on Twitter talking to fellow Stephen King fanatics. It's a strange thing because social media did not exist in the 80s and early 90s when I was really devouring that great first period of Stephen King's work. And so it's almost like here we are in 2018 playing catch up on all the conversations that we should have had 30 years ago. But in the interim, since I last spoke about this show, I read a really interesting review on bloodydisgusting.com. They got to interview the show's co-creator Sam Shaw at Comic-Con, and he had some cool things to say about the future of the show. And without reading the quote in full, because it's a pretty long paragraph, he basically said that each season of Castle Rock is supposed to be like an unpublished novel by Stephen King, and that each season will be a standalone story set in Castle Rock, but they might jump around the timeline, they might jump around in different genres. While this season in particular is very heavily inspired by Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, they say they do have a really great idea for a monster story set in 1974. And while Hulu is not officially renewed as season 2 yet, I think if people keep ranting and raving about the show the way they have the last week, season 2 is very likely. I've been trying hard not to oversell the show because I don't think this show is one of those absolute clear-cut home runs like Twin Peaks or Game of Thrones. That said, I think it's incredibly solid and it deals with a lot of material that I find fascinating. So for my own part, I hope they continue to make seasons of Castle Rock for a very long time. Another thing I didn't know when I posted my review the first 3 episodes is that Kevin Smith's podcasting partner, Mark Bernardin, is one of the writers on the show. If you like Mark Bernardin's pop culture commentary, and for my money, he has a lot of really interesting things to say about superhero movies and sci-fi and fantasy. While he's had a very successful career writing for people like The Hollywood Reporter, I'm really enjoying seeing him have the opportunity of a lateral move into working as a storyteller, not just a story commentator. But let's dive right into the latest episode, The Box, and right from the get-go, I really enjoyed the title because it reminded me of a lot of Stephen King stories from the past. In his book Skeleton Crew, which is right there, he has one of the craziest short stories called The Raft, one that I absolutely love. They did a pretty spooky adaptation of it in Creepshow 2, a movie which I'm embarrassed to admit really upset me as a teenager. I actually stayed up all night reading comic books with the lights on while spending the night at a friend's house because I was too freaked out to go to sleep after seeing The Raft. Watching it now, it doesn't quite work, but the short story The Raft is very solid. But also the title of this episode reminded me of The Crate from Creepshow 1. Stephen King collaborated with George Romero on Creepshow. It's a movie that I still love dearly to this day. And there's something just beautifully mysterious and enigmatic by these very simple one-syllable titles, The Box. And I just love how every aspect of this show seems to be trying to pay homage to Stephen King at all times without just making it a glorified Easter egg fest. I think it's very important for shows and movies that love great stuff from the past not to just become a celebration of great Easter eggs, but become a celebration of the spirit of the movie or book or show that they fell in love with in the first place. And on the whole so far, I feel like this show has been successful at adapting the spirit of Stephen King without constantly trying to leave a trail of breadcrumbs of little pop cultural references. In any case, this episode begins with some pretty interesting flashbacks. The longer Henry Deaver stays in Castle Rock, the more memories are coming back to him from his 11-day disappearance as a kid. And we see that he basically looks like he's in a cage down underground, and it reminded me a little bit of the cage that we find the inmate in at Shawshank. Whether or not there's a connection between Henry Deaver being placed in a cage as a kid and this mysterious inmate at Shawshank being placed in a cage, that remains to be seen, but that immediate parallel was tough to ignore. So far, Deaver has been unsuccessful at getting the prisoner released, but he does have a court date coming up. But we see that while they're awaiting that date, people are trying to intimidate the prisoner at Shawshank. They even come into his cell and threaten him with all sorts of horrible violence. And I love how he just stands up, and it seems like he's almost like 8 or 9 feet tall as he just walks toward the man and then closes the door to his own cell. And in this episode, we get a lot more evidence about all the abuses going on at Shawshank. Prisoners are getting talcum powder thrown in their eyes deliberately to blind them. We see that prisoners are just being beaten indiscriminately around the prison at all hours. And it's really starting to get to the guard Dennis, who is increasingly eager to cooperate with Henry Deaver and get his story out to the public. But we see over the course of this episode that Henry Deaver's time in Castle Rock is really starting to have a negative impact on him, and he's increasingly reluctant to go to trial and wants instead just to take the deal that was originally offered and and get the prisoner out as fast as possible so that he can leave Castle Rock and get back to Houston, where he plans on dragging, basically against her will, his mother, played by Sissy Spacek. Without any real concern for what she might feel about it, he actually wants to take her away from her home and place her in a strange environment where she knows no one. And while she might seem pretty senile or suffering from dementia, scenes where she's like hacking away at fish and talking about how she doesn't really like to eat trout, but she really enjoys cleaning and gutting them. When she learns about Deaver's plans, she basically says, look, the only way I'm ever leaving this city is in a coffin. And because Deaver is growing increasingly agitated, he continues to suspect that somehow Alan might have had something to do with Henry Deaver's disappearance as a child. But finally, Alan's had enough with the suspicion, and he actually confronts Deaver and says, look, while you were gone, I talked to your dad while he was dying in bed from a broken back, and in spite of the pain, he wrote out in bold letters on a note that Henry Deaver was responsible for pushing him off the cliff. That revelation completely floors Henry, but also he goes out to this semi-abandoned house less than a mile from where he was found on that frozen lake because he wants to investigate this family with the last name Desjardins. There was a Desjardins who had been released from prison a couple weeks prior to Henry's disappearance. But when Deaver gets out there, he meets the brother of Desjardins, this total eccentric named Joseph, who seems to be running a barbershop in a place where there are no people. I don't think he gets a lot of customers, because in one room we see how the ceiling has become so rotted, a piano has completely crashed through down below. But because Desjardins is a bit of a pack rat, he does actually have the police file on Henry Deaver that allows Deaver to get a little more information on his disappearance at the time, because he had been told for many decades that the file on his disappearance had completely disappeared. So while Deaver is wrestling with all these revelations and all this new information, he finds a lot of comfort in spending time with Molly Strand. But we see that Molly's wrestling with trying to find the perfect opportunity to tell Deaver that she was the one responsible for actually pulling the plug on Deaver's father. She never finds that moment, and Deaver and Molly are starting to get a little intimate. He ends up spending the night at her place. And when he wakes up, he basically decides, I'm ready to leave Castle Rock. He leaves Dennis a message saying, look, I'm going to take the deal, I'm going to get the prisoner out, and I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm going back to Houston, which prompts a very interesting response in Dennis. Earlier in the episode, if you remember, Dennis went down to visit the prisoner in Shawshank, and as a way of establishing a little rapport, he reached through and did a little fist bump. And as we've seen so far, anytime you touch this guy or you spend too much time in close proximity, it can have a negative impact on your health or your temperament. Whether or not there's a connection between the fist bump and what Dennis does subsequently, I can't say for sure, but I am suspicious that there is a connection because Dennis goes on a murderous rampage. Throughout the episode, we've seen his temperament growing increasingly grim, and he's trying to combat it by drawing smiley faces in all the monitors. But on the day where he snaps, he just starts crossing things out, grabs a gun, and decides to walk through Shawshank, shooting every single guard that he comes across. But much like at the end of episode 1 and the beginning of episode 2, where he saw the prisoner on all the monitors walking through killing people, it appears as if that was actually a nice bit of foreshadowing, because we actually see the scene through those same monitors, and we see Dennis taking everybody out. So once again, it appears as if Dennis' actions are connected to this prisoner on two levels, either through the physical contact or through those visions that he had at the end of the first episode, because he basically makes all those visions come true, murdering everybody in sight. Henry Deaver actually has a front row seat for some of the action, including the end of the confrontation where Dennis gets laid low by a shotgun blast. But as ruthless and savage as the sequence might have been, I feel like this episode really needed that. While this show might not be a horror show specifically, anytime you do a show based on the works of Stephen King, I feel like every episode needs something huge to really keep you on the hook. And throughout the episode, I just kept thinking, all right, is there going to be something that scares me? Is there going to be something that unnerves me? Is there going to be something that upsets me? And wisely, they did choose to end this episode with this really dramatic scene, which will definitely keep people coming back for more with episode 5 next week. It's crazy. And next week, we're actually going to be at the halfway point of the first season. I most likely will not get a chance to review it because I'm going to be traveling next week, but I'll definitely be checking out at midnight as soon as the episode drops. In any case, if you enjoyed my reaction or review, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk about Stephen King or this TV show or horror or whatever, you can always hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax or leave a comment in the comments below. And I'll be back in a couple days for a couple videos. I'm going to be doing a season 1 review of Succession on HBO, a show I've been absolutely loving. I'll be tackling the latest episode of Sharp Objects, and most importantly, I'll be diving into Better Call Saul, which comes back with season 4 on Monday. Not only is Better Call Saul one of the best written shows out there, they've already renewed it for season 5, so AMC must have seen something in season 4 that they really liked. But thanks as always for watching my video. I really appreciate it. Onwards and upwards.